We're here ready for Governance 102.
So we're going to have a fun conversation about conflict, if we're all ready. We'll talk about resolution. We're going to talk about where it comes from, too. So, I like to tell stories. I think that we remember them. The other day, I was sitting in my car, and I was saying I have younger children, and they were sitting behind me, and some woman, it was one of those where we were in a three-way stop, and I stopped, and it was my turn to go, and the woman happened to kind of miss the stop sign that was right there, just down the street, not in your community, outside the community, and she was irate. I mean, I wasn't even close to cutting her off. She was irate at me, and she had missed her sign, and so my kids, of course, they were sitting in the back looking over going, what is wrong with her? And you see her, like pounding the steering wheel, and lots of 4- and 5-letter words that my children learned. And so we kind of giggled, and I was like, okay. And then I started getting mad because we were now 2 miles down the road, the 4th stoplight, and she's still going on, honking the horn, sitting behind me. And I realized this was a teaching moment with my kids because I kind of wanted to just get out of my car, turn around, and be like, what's your problem? And in that moment, I worked on something called empathy with them. And so I turned behind and I said, I wonder who hurt her. I wonder who made her get that angry about something so small. I wonder what happened this morning. I wonder if she had a bad day. And honestly, I really just kind of wanted to turn around and say a few 4-letter words back. But the reality is that underneath all conflict, there are stories we don't know. But the reality is, underneath all conflict, no matter which side of it, there is something we don't know. There are stories underneath there. And I told you this before, but the reality is that they've done some studies about the top performing boards who actually do well and what are the qualities of them. And it is no surprise that empathy is right at the top. Compassion. It's fascinating. If those of you are familiar with healthcare right now, what's going on in healthcare, there's this thing called value-based purchasing. So now when hospitals get reimbursed, it's based on the patient experience. Any of you have been in the hospital recently and get a survey afterwards? So the hospitals aren't allowed to tell you this, but I can because I don't work for one. Their reimbursements come from your experience. Was my pain controlled well? Answer on a scale of 1 to 10. I felt that nursing responded to my needs. They literally get paid based on the scores. 29% of their payment comes from those scores. They're called HCAPs. Yes. And the outcomes, which is why you keep getting calls afterwards, because if you get readmitted, they don't get paid. Even if it's because you didn't follow your own discharge orders. Even if you go home and don't take your medication that you were supposed to and get readmitted because of your own negligence, the hospitals don't get paid as much anymore for your care. So it's fascinating. This is kind of interesting stuff happening. But so all of this concern is now turning to the patient experience, right? How do you experience healthcare? Do you know the #1 correlation for patient experience and satisfaction? Compassion. It's not actually the quality of care, it's the perception. So you can have a terrible experience, and if that nurse sits and holds your hand for 15 minutes when you're really upset, that's what's going to transform your experience. You're going to write 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, even if your pain wasn't managed. So it's interesting because it's changing the way healthcare is given. And you're probably going, what's the story behind this? How does this relate? But I think it's really important to understand what you know matters, but acknowledging what you don't know in conflict matters just as much, if not more. You don't know what's triggering somebody or what happened or how words. Do any of you have words that just set you off? You can think about it and you don't have to share what they are, but somebody just says it or it's that tone of voice and it's just like, that's it. Even if it's irrational, it puts you in a place. Maybe it's happy, maybe it's sad, maybe it's angry, but there's something somebody says or does and it makes you think about it. So there's a lot of different types of conflict. And so I told you I've been teaching this in college for a long time, and this is the academic side of it. But I think this is a really pertinent slide because this is kind of, We think about conflict and we don't think about why conflict may be arising, because sometimes you look at it and go, really? Like my situation in the car where I'm driving and 2 miles lady, I mean, she's literally mouthing, I hate you, I hope you die, expletive, 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 and I am like, what happened here? We don't understand. So there's different types of conflict, and they need to be handled a little bit differently, and we need to think about them differently. So on one hand, you have content conflict. These are much more, it's about what's happening instead of who's and why's in there, that inner struggle. So a content conflicts, the first one's regarding values and beliefs. So if you think about this, this is where like animal rights activists are going to be out there picketing, right? They're going to throw red paint on the fur jacket. That is their value and belief that an animal is just as important as a human being, and all living beings are living beings. Also striking for wage. When you have unions or groups that are striking for wages, that's a fundamental content conflict about value. My services are worth more than you're paying me for. That's what that comes down to. There's also regarding goals. So you may have a board. It may be if you are working in an organization where there's conflict between a manager, staff, or a board and board members about budget. This is where our money needs to be spent, right? No, we can't spend the money there because this is what needs to be spent on. This is how it needs to be done. There's conflict there. If you feel like somebody's withholding money or resources that you need to do something, that's going to be about goals. This is where we should be building and developing. Remember when we talked about that shared sense of purpose? This is really important because you have to have a shared sense of purpose to make decisions about goals without conflict.
Group level.
The question is that personal and group? No, not necessarily. It can be. But you can have a whole group of people saying we need to be paid more. That's a group effort saying our collective compensation. You could be striking, or animal rights could be group. It doesn't have to be individual. In the same way, it could be one staff member on a team can say, I need the resources to do my job. You're asking me to cut 20% of my budget, right? My operational expenses, but you're not giving me what I need to do that. So it can be both. They're not necessarily individual or group. They can show up differently each way. It's really about what the conflict is centered on. So that's a content conflict. These ones tend to be a little easier to resolve because it's give me the resources. Okay, but content conflicts then get muddled by what we like to discuss as relational conflicts, which has probably been the source of humanity's existence since the beginning of time. The first one, there are 3 different types, and let me clarify, these overlap frequently. These overlap because we have experiences from our life, professionally, personally, where we have those triggers. It's when somebody says that word, how it's interpreted. You ever walked out of a room and people have been mad and you're shaking your head going, I don't even understand where that went off the tracks, right? For some reason it didn't incite you, but somebody else did. So the first one is issues of esteem. This is a tricky one, and this is actually, I'll give a little disclosure here, this is one of my big ones. I hate when people are late. Like, it eats at me. It irks me to no end. And it's not because my plans are disrupted. It's because I said my time is valuable to you. So I am here, or my time is valuable to you, and your time is valuable to me. In that exchange of values, I have said, we will meet at 10 a.m. And I sit at Starbucks at 10 a.m. And if you don't show up and you're like, oh, sorry, I just lost track of time, I wasn't important to you as you were to me. That's an issue of esteem. It's about shared understanding of what's important. So this shows up in governance and in board and team dynamics, because now we're going to shift. This is a lot about team dynamics rather than governance, but it's a part of governance. In a team situation, you don't understand why person A, say, I'm trying to pick a name that no one here has, and I don't know everyone's name, say, Claire gets upset because Phil walks in every day 5 minutes late to the meeting. And no one can understand why she just is aggravated through the whole meeting. It's because Claire feels that Phil is not respecting her time. That's an issue of esteem. Issues of control. This is about what is most important. This shows up on what should be on the agenda. feels like a content issue, but it's actually you build the agenda, I tell you this is important to me, and then you take it off the agenda, and then we don't talk about it. There's issues of control. These can be managed. It's really simple. If you're the one controlling, the agenda is not the only reason or purpose this shows up, but if you're controlling the agenda and have to cut something off, do you explain why? Hey, I wanted to, but I heard back from the committee, they're not going to be ready to present. Boom, next meeting. That minimizes the control feeling, because it's really not about you controlling an agenda and this person not feeling heard. It's really about content stuff. We're not ready. So you see where all these types of conflicts start getting really messy, and when you have one conflict, there's usually about 17 layers of the onion to unpeel. The next one is an issue of affiliation. This is that criticism piece. You may say something and not feel like you were criticizing somebody, and for whatever reason, maybe their mom used to use that word or that tone, or there was a smell in the room. Smells are really important to triggering human behavior, and it's very odd. We don't think about it. Have any of you walked in somewhere and been like, oh, this puts you back? Told you I was in DC the other day, and we walked into a building, and my son goes, it smells like Goodwill in here. I like this place. He likes to shop at Goodwill because mom gives him $5 in an hour and he has the time of his life. So we walk into this government building and he immediately associates that this is the best place on earth because it smells just like Goodwill. They just happen to use the same air fresheners. That's all it comes down to. But smells trigger us. And so somebody may be having a response that you don't realize. Issues of affiliation, the criticism. It doesn't feel good to me, so I'm going to shut down, right? Or there's the other response. I have 2 team members. One of them, if she feels criticized, you don't hear from her for weeks. Just whatever you need to function. The other one, arms swinging, right? They're ready to go to battle. We're going to hash this out. We're going to get to the bottom of this. Let's just talk it out. So we all have different responses when we feel criticized. Criticism can also be felt in issues of affiliation, of feeling left out. Well, I wasn't invited. I guess I'm not important. It seems small. I wasn't asked to be on that committee. I guess I'm not valued. All of a sudden we're back. A lot of this gets back to kind of your psychological upbringing and things that happen, your culture of origin. So much of this is why my CEO, he always talks about working with executives. He's eminently qualified because he studied child psychology and economics. It's true. Much of the work comes down to psychology, not necessarily child psychology, but having the understanding of what's causing people to not feel included or left out. So we all have these, and these overlap frequently. I think it's important to be mindful of this and to step back if there is a sense of conflict and try and figure out. There is one thing you can do if there's conflict that's really easy, that we are all terrified to do. It's to pull someone aside and go, everything okay? Something happened? You seem uncomfortable. Not in front of the whole group. That's embarrassing. That gets to issues of esteem, affiliation, goals, all sorts of things. But when you see it, human nature, we feel like, oh, something's wrong. But we tend to go, oh, no, I don't want to ask about that. No, I'm not going to get into that. But by asking that, you may be able to take off a layer of the onion before it builds and grows, to 17 more layers. When it comes to governance, outside of these, you also have more types of conflict that can emerge. The first one is amongst board members. And I'm pretty sure none of you have ever experienced that before. So we'll just skip it.
All of the above.
I'm just kidding. Conflict on the board, it happens frequently. It arises as a result of individual directors, a faction, a group of directors. There's personal things that happen outside the board that may come back up on the board. There's disagreements. There's the old board versus the new board if there's new members, and this is how we've always done it, and we don't want to try new. There are a multitude of ways in which this can show up. But then you have conflict between the board and the staff. So, and I'm hearing some of that. Well, we don't trust them to do this. What if they're not going to do it right? How is this going to happen? When you look at Carver's model of governance, when there is conflict amongst staff, who's responsible for managing that typically? the executive team. It may be the CEO, it may be the other executives there. It's their role and responsibility to handle that. But it still happens. You know, you don't feel, and those can come back to issues of esteem, priority, content, all of those things. Should this be important? How should this be handled? There's also, and you're thinking, how does this show up in governance? The conflict amongst the staff. You guys have an interesting dynamic here. You have, I don't know if any board members are also employees. I don't know if that's even allowed because I have a feeling, but you do have staff members who are also constituents, who are residents of this community.
No.
There are community members who work on staff. There are part-time. Part-time, I know that they're here. There are part-time staffers that work here, and that can be challenging because you have staff members who are also, you're representing, and it can get tricky. You are representing them. You as a board member are representing them. They vote. They help select. So that can be challenging as well. So you have an extra layer in there as well. Staff members, organization, and the staff members. So sometimes when bylaws are ignored, this is where we see organization and staff member conflict. It basically, if you ignore the bylaws, it can frustrate the staff. We see this a lot there, where, oh, that doesn't apply, or I'm going to go around this, and this tends to show up as micromanagement. But when you are executors of policy, that's what your role is as a board member, and when the bylaws are not followed or exceptions are made, that puts staff in a really conflicting place. Because now they have somebody who's here in governance that's overseeing their boss's boss. That can cause conflict. Telling me I should do this when really the bylaws say this and the rules that they have for work say this. And that can cause a ton of conflict. We see this frequently. This happens a lot, not here necessarily, but it happens a lot in governance situations. Where when you go around the way the system's set up, it puts everybody in a compromising position, as well as it puts you at risk. It puts the organization at risk, it puts the board at risk, it puts everyone at risk because you're circumventing the rules that are and parameters that are put in place to protect everybody. These are not boxes. This is not concrete, black and white. A lot of this overlaps. A lot of conflict, yeah. So I want to talk about conflict with the managing agent in particular. So why does conflict with the managing agent usually arise? It usually arises because there's a lack of clarity about roles and boundaries. Or it's clearly stated and ignored. I hear somebody saying performance. Performance of staff is not the board's responsibility. At a high level, it is. But that does not mean, in typical, I have never heard of a board asking for individual performance reviews for every single individual. They will ask for a report at a high level about how are we doing? You know, if you have a 5-point performance management scale, what's the overall score by department? Customer service. You guys have customer service. I don't know if you guys require. Do you have customer service satisfaction? Quizzes or assessments?
No.
And that's a huge, in a service organization, a lot of times you see that. There's feedback. And it's not individual scores, it's looking by department. Okay. So how's maintenance doing in terms of customer service? High level. Managing the activities that build that, that's the responsibility of the managing agent and of your executive team to execute upon those activities. Okay, so I heard there was a problem with people going to the staff. So there was a assigned delegate who, right, that they handle that at a high level and manage that. So a lot of times this happens. This also happens with inadequate communication. So is the communication, and it seems here this is lesser of an issue. Sometimes in those more passive boards, you'll see people who they just aren't communicating with staff. The expectations aren't clearly set. But I have to tell you, in terms of inadequate communication, a big one is, does the staff know the direction? That's why that vision, that mission statement, the purpose that you're establishing are so important, because the staff needs something to rally behind. They need to know how to prioritize. Not just the leader, not just the board setting governance, but staff. they need to know the direction they're heading in. That's why it's so important. And so inadequate communication may not be, oh, we're telling them, on Tuesday we're having a meeting here. It can be as big as that high-level vision stuff, I'll call it, that we were talking about before. And it's hard because it's hard to establish, and it's not concrete, so it can be uncomfortable for people. So what are some ways to manage this? Number one, this is what it comes back to, effective delegation. If there is this constant back and forth and going to staff, and that's an issue, you figure out a mechanism. Nope, we're not all going to staff every time anymore. We have one delegate, it goes to them, they aggregate it, they have the conversation, and they're addressed through these two people. Organizational structure and clear lines of responsibility. This is what the board is responsible for, articulating it, stating it. This is what the executive is responsible for, stating it. This is what the staff is responsible for. That is probably a decision that if you're telling the executive they're responsible for it, they should probably articulate which staff are responsible for it. Especially in a time of culture change. You may say we've done this already, but I'm hearing we want to change it. I'm also hearing it's changing. This is good. But these conversations need to be had. I can't remember if I shared this with you all, but at the last class we talked about, do you know what humans do? This has been studied over and over and over, what humans do when they don't know? What do they fill in the information gap with?
Make up their own story.
But what type of story? It's the worst case scenario for them. It's very bizarre. Humans by nature tend to be somewhat optimistic when you look at the spectrum, but when there's an information gap, they fill in with the worst case scenario for themselves. We get very kind of narcissistic in it and very pessimistic. So I give the, what? And paranoid, yes, that too. So I give the example of, I worked at a large organization and I sat outside the director of operations and he had two voices, sleeping and screaming. That was it. There was nothing between. I didn't work directly for him, but his door was like here, where that wall is, and my desk was right here. So they were relocating the headquarters temporarily while they excavated and just like they rebuilt the headquarters from the ground up. And so he was sitting there screaming and yelling about where it was going, so I knew exactly where it was going. There was no question. And I went to lunch. Sit down at the lunch table. I know, and I'm not going to say anything because that was not given to me directly. It was just overheard. And everyone who sat at that table that lived south said the headquarters was going north, and they insisted. Anyone who lived north said it was going south. Anyone who lived east said it was going west. You get the picture. Everyone at that table swore up and down. They heard it straight from the source that it was going to impact them negatively. And the truth was it went a mile away. It impacted nobody by more than 2 minutes. But human nature, and I remember it was so funny because I thought I've heard this study so many times, over and over, replicated. That's what we do. So when there isn't clear lines of responsibility and there aren't clear structures articulated for everyone, staff, boards, everyone's going to fill in the worst case scenario for themselves, typically. I live in the community. I go to local Starbucks. I hear things, okay? And everyone was up in arms at the Trader Joe's, like, oh, we're never going to have a bus. That's it. We're going to be stranded. We're taking Uber. They said we have to get Uber. Like, it was out there. This was maybe a week or two ago. I mean, I sat in Trader Joe's behind this in line and heard everyone going on and on about it. So this happens. Everyone will fill in. I mean, I don't even have a smartphone. How am I going to get an Uber? Like, these were the conversations that were being had in the community.
I think the question is about closed door meeting.
Okay, closed door meetings, yeah. People will, and that's the reality. So my challenge to you then is, I know closed door meetings have to happen. Are you mindful of the communication outside to minimize conflict with staff, residents? About what is your mechanism on the backside of it? Because it needs to happen, and I'm not saying everything should be public. No way. Decisions need to be deliberated, and there has to be some parameters on it, but you need to be aware that people are talking, and in this day and age, I mean, let's look at the news lately. There's not a lot of there's a lot of transparency in the world. How many people are cowering? I was just talking to a cab driver about this a few weeks ago. You can't hide much anymore. People speculate, they know, there's text, there's this, there's that. So how do you as a board, how are you going to manage that communication? Really important.
You can do about it.
The statement was,
On the door.
yeah, the statement was residents are disengaged until something comes to them and it's in its final form and it's been out there. I know this. Again,
Yeah.
it's Trader Joe's, Starbucks.
Right.
This goes on for 6 months and then they hear it and everyone gets up in arms. So the question is, how do you then communicate with everyone in advance and throughout, so there's proactive communication. But you're absolutely right. At a certain point, it falls on the resident to actually pick it up and read that paper, read that announcement. I also know that there's a lot of political websites, publications, yada, yada, you name it, that are in place that don't have a lot of accurate information in it. And it's a lot of inciting. Technology can be a blessing, but it can also be a curse, because then you're contending with political websites, all sorts of things that may have misinformation. So with the managing agent, I want to stick with this. This is really important to have good management structures. Who is responsible for what? Clarifying that, articulating this. It's really easy to go, oh, well, we've been doing this for so long, we don't need to. But really, if you state it and have that conversation, it can clear it up. You are in a new day, right? We're trying to start new. We're starting to make change. Have that conversation. Who's responsible for what? How is it going to happen? When there's conflict with the staff, with the managing agent, who do you go to? How is it handled? Are those protocols established? Also, good management committees and senior staff relationships. This is not just with the CEO, that all senior staff, that there's a good, open, trusting relationship built. That will help minimize conflict. In community boards, that comes up, is conflict with factions, okay? These are small groups of special interest that kind of segment off and they're driving for one purpose or agenda. This happens very frequently. I know it's happened here. I don't know if it's active right now. I know it's happened in the past. And this is going to happen when committees are going to split over a significant decision or strategy. This is where the bumper stickers come out, right? We all have a decision. We're all going to stick our stake in the ground and we are not budging on it. This is where we need to go. This is the direction we need to move in. It also comes when individual values conflict with the best interest of the organization. So, this is the hardest challenge as a board member. You are responsible for your entire community. You essentially, when you're all unified together, are responsible for a city in the operations, and not just the current operations, but the future operations, which is really hard to remember sometimes. What's going to happen in 15, 20 years? For residents who've moved in here, who may be sticking around going, hey, I plan to live here for the next 40 years, maybe longer. How is that going to work? Are your decisions for the long-term betterment of the community? Because when the trust was built and put together, it was put together because it wasn't about the decisions in the now, right? The trust was built so that we could protect the long-term future of the community. Also can happen when new members or election or appointment arise. So all of a sudden we can side and, oh, they have this agenda and this is how little pockets or factions develop. And these are entirely caustic to an organization and to a governance. So how do you manage this? Because you're like, okay, I got it. It happens. I see it. The opportunity is to look for win-wins. So how can you figure out a way to satisfy both interest groups? Is there a way? It may not mean that you both get 100% win, but you're both getting something out of it. The next thing is to consider strategic planning our options or approaches. Sometimes we just need to step back and go, are we considering everything? Because so many times we go, this is how we're going to do it. I'm going to start on this path, and this person says, I'm going to do it this way. And everyone starts moving out different directions with their blinders on because we've already made a decision, and we're not going to consider anything. When really, if we go right in the middle, there's actually another solution there that we didn't even consider, but because we've been so stuck here, sometimes taking a time out and going, let's step back if we're stuck on an issue. How do we step back and look and go, is there something we're missing here? Let's just start, maybe not from scratch doing all the data, but let's step back and look at this from a high level perspective and go, there might be something else here that we have overlooked. Also, review your decision-making approach. Sometimes we just get in a habit. This is cultural. This is how we make decisions, right? If you have a group of friends, in your family, you know, with a spouse, whatever it is, sometimes we're just like, well, they're the person who makes all the decisions, right? Oh, they're the one. Oh, just let them decide. They always do that. That can happen, and it can get us into cultural trouble. So one of the things I suggest sometimes is look up decision-making approaches. There are like 17,000 different models of how to make a decision. If you really want to change things up, find one that you can all agree on and go through it and say, we're going to use this approach this time. And it outlines. I mean, you can Google decision-making models, and there are so many different types. And just by changing that up, it may help minimize some of the conflict. And then also remember your role. If it gets heated and contentious and laden with conflict, it's really important to step back and remember why you're here. How many of you have had a moment where you can think back and go, yeah, we got to a point where it was so much about the issues we forgot about our job and our responsibility as board members? Probably happened to most of you at one point in time because it's human nature. Step back and remember the role. That's why having a vision or a mission statement is so important. This is what we're about. Maybe you appoint somebody that when it gets contentious, that's just their job. Their job is to stop and say, this is what we're about, and read it out loud. And it may not be for the whole community. You may decide as a board, this is something we do with boards all the time. What's your individual, at this moment, the people sitting on this board, what's your purpose? Can you create a unified statement? This is what we're about. This is what we want to do. Especially when you have new members come on, state it. Write it down. This is our job for the next however long this board's going to be together. This is what we want to do. And if you state that and can reference it, it can actually minimize a lot of conflict because you kind of rearrange your eyes and kind of reset where you're looking and remember what's important. Now, there are some issues worth fighting about, and there's some that probably are best left to just try and come up with a win-win. The next one is conflict within our circles. This is that same idea of a faction. It's a small group, but this is more personal than it is about issues. These are people who just want to work together. They kind of run the show. They want to do it their way because they have, or they want to do it differently, and so they're all aligning internally. It's less about a special interest, and it's more just about the personal side of it. This can happen, and you have an issue with inner circles when everyone's like, well, I'll just vote for that because I trust this person, and they're not going to hear out the whole story, get all the facts. It's just, I trust you on it, and you're my friend, so I'm going to do it this way. Or, we work together on this, so we're going to operate this way. This usually arises because a specific agenda is achieved without opposition or interference. So sometimes people won't say anything, and then at the end they go, oh, well, they just did that because they're buddies. They're in the same social group, same social circle. And so it's almost like resentment instead of direct conflict. It's that the next time that a vote goes the wrong way, it's, well, they just always vote for each other. Or we're going to do this. It can also be a split between old and new members. New members come on, they're not happy. Again, there's a political element to your appointment because you are voted. So there is some essential politicking that has to happen, and this innately causes this sense of us, them, you, me, because you may be positioning against each other and having to talk about issues up front. A lack of energy or time spent to reconcile viewpoints. Sometimes this happens because everyone goes, I am just too tired. Just make a decision. I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to have a hard conversation. Just want this to be over, like the conflict training, because it's getting closer to time being done. So that can be another part that can lead to it. So how do you manage this? Conduct a skills analysis. Have you ever actually taken the time, if you're stuck, to really talk about, I did this in a former life. Oh, I'm really good at this. One way to do this is there's some great leadership tools that are free or very cheap. Gallup has Strengths Finder. I think it's like $13, $14. You can buy it on Amazon. You can ship it, and you go online, or you can do it manually. I think it'll give you a code, and you answer these questions, and it tells you your 5 strengths. Talk about it as a board. Look at it. We do this all the time. We go into organizations and we come in and we sit with the board and we say, this is where you have alignment. This is where you have great support. You guys are all like-minded in this. And here's where you're different. That's a good thing. You want someone, one of the strengths finders is to be a maximizer. So maximizers, we have a few on our team and we've done this as a firm. And maximizers just like to get stuff done. They're going to go, go, go. It's great. You want maximizers on your team. They figure out how to make it happen even when it seems impossible. They also take on a lot of work and burn out really fast. Because if no one else is going to do it, they're going to go, I'll get it done. And then they get to a point where they're spent. So having that conversation and knowing your strengths and weaknesses can help with inner circles, because you look at people in a new light. Wow, it looks like Joe is showing up all crabby to these meetings and they just don't want to do anything anymore. Sorry if there's a Joe in this room. Is there a Joe? Okay, good. Joe is just done. Well, what you don't know is that Joe's a maximizer, and for 15 years, spanning 2 decades, he's been on the board forever, and he's just done, and no one wants to step up, and he doesn't want anyone who's not qualified to step up, so he's just going to keep doing it. So Joe's tired. It may be that, Sue, hope there's not a Sue here, is a woo. Woo, W-O-O. It's actually one of the strength finders. People with the gift of woo, which is the least common strength in the strength finder system, they have the gift to sell a story. They can set a vision. They can get people involved and excited about it. But people who have the gift of woo get frustrated when action's not taken. So Sue shows up, and Sue's crabby because Sue the woo can't see anything getting done, and she's tired of using her gift, which is really important to change an organization, to give a community a sense of purpose, because she's hit a wall for so many times. Having this conversation lets you see somebody in a different light. There are a ton of them out there. Imperative, you can even do a Myers-Briggs assessment. There's one, it's called 16 Personalities. It's online. And the Myers-Briggs and it talks about your personality types. 16 Personalities is free, and it gives you like a 15-page report. It tells you how you show up at home, how you show up at work, your strengths, your weaknesses. Get to know each other, because then those inner circles might break down a little bit, because you realize there's untapped resources in there. If you really want to have a good time, let a significant other or a best friend or someone read one of your assessments and then have a conversation over a glass of wine. So another way is to consider induction process to ensure that members can contribute as quickly as possible. Do you do an onboarding? New members come on board. Do you take time to get to know each other? Do you reset the vision with the new board? Do you set behavioral expectations? Do you state them, or do you go, here's the bylaws, this is what we expect from you? Yeah, sign on the bottom line. Prick your finger in blood. We want it in blood, your name right here. The fact of the matter is that we have to set expectations with a new board. It allows this us, them, we, they, it disappears. Because we are a board. There's no us and them. We're working together. Take the time to onboard new members, and not just, here's when financial reports are due, here's when the meetings are. Actually getting to know each other on an interpersonal level. Jim's always said this, my CEO, and it's funny, I now find myself saying it, find out what melts their butter. What revs their engine? What gets them excited to show up and do the job that they were appointed to do? It's really important. Clarify authority for tasks, decision-making, and reporting. Sounds silly. Talk about how decisions should be made. I heard Section 13 of our bylaws say that we should be using Robert Rules of Order, but we really don't. Talk about how a decision should be made. What are your board's expectations for this? Because again, what happens afterwards? You're standing, you're eating all this delicious food, and everyone's, did you see how they just took control and took over and they didn't follow the rules? And then that person may think, wow, that was great, we got consensus. What a quick decision was made. That's where conflict starts, and then it just sits here and it festers. Defining the decision-making process is so important. There are great models online. I could spend 3 days teaching you different decision-making models. Research them. There's a quick search. You can go to the library and get books. Talk about it. How are we as a board, this new board, going to make decisions? It's really important. Ask for outside help and mediation when it gets serious. It is so hard to do this sometimes, but can you imagine, I mean, let's have a very candid conversation about just in general conflict. This is not just here, but in the workplace. Do you know how much money is spent on legal matters and lawsuits over basic conflict that just goes left unchecked? And it escalates, and it escalates, and it escalates. This is everywhere. I know here, but everywhere. And if before it gets serious, when it's going from the spectrum to out of control to this seems minor, when it starts hitting that moderate time point, ask for help. Is there someone on staff? Is there someone on the board who's really good at mediating? Is there, sometimes it's going to an external and saying, you know what, this is about to blow up in our faces. It's worth the investment to hire somebody, whatever it is, to handle this now. Because when you circle and cycle out of control, the community feels that, right? They see it. They literally see it on television. So it's really important to get that in check before it gets to the serious level. Okay, so here's the comment I heard, which is, in corporate world, you know, you escalate, okay, there's a problem, and I go, okay, you're my manager, I'm gonna say, hey, great, we have a conflict, can you help intervene?
Well, hold on.
But in the board, there's not.
To escalate.
No, but have you determined in advance what you're gonna do with conflict? If we don't agree, have you decided who's gonna do that? How are you gonna handle it? This is the expectation setting, why it's so important. You should know what you're gonna do with conflict before you even have it. Where are we going to escalate it to? Are we going to get a third-party mediator? Are we going to bring in somebody? Is there a mediator in your community that everyone can agree on who might volunteer services and time? That is truly neutral. Like I'm talking actually skilled, licensed mediator. There are options, and the key is creating the expectation and making the decision before you're in the conflict. That's the important part. So the statement was, and you're absolutely right, technically, and by bylaws and everything put together, you're president and then you have a vice president. In many cases, boards, they'll have a chair and a co-chair in governance situations. They're there and are elected and appointed, which is why you should be careful and mindful of when you're doing this. This is serious. It's important and it has a bearing on your community. Those roles should be appointed carefully and judiciously because technically that's there. If there's a conflict, what I'm guessing is, what if it's with a president or a vice president? How do you handle it? My statement is that you need to look at your bylaws, which will be different. That may be established already. It needs to be stated in advance. If we come to an impasse, this is where we're going to go. Okay, so orientation, onboarding, induction. So that's taking the time to get to know a board. That's what I talked about, doing a personality assessment, spending some time together, getting to know each other, knowing each other's strengths and weaknesses. Not, oh, guess what, I was a vice president of HR, or I was an accountant for 43 years. It's actually getting the time to not know the resume, but know how that person works and operates, and establishing how you as a new board now with new members are going to operate. What are the expectations? How are we going to handle conflict? Where do we escalate it? Talking through those things and building this expectation. Most boards actually, I don't think it exists here from what I've seen. Most boards have an evaluation. They do a board evaluation of themselves every single year. I was working on one this morning for another board for their CEO. Board self-assessment, CEO. That is every 12 months without question done. If you have that parameter, which I strongly recommend, are you making sure that those people are aware, probably even prior to running for the position, these are the behavioral expectations. You will A, B, C, D, and we're going to assess one another on this. Or if you don't want to go to that level, this is change, you're going to at least assess the board as a whole about that and have a conversation. Every time we get a new board, which is at a minimum once a year, it changes. You're going to have a tough conversation about how you build continuity on that. Many organizations, it's set, it's voted on, and it stays. Now, here, I understand that can be challenging. You have like 5 different boards operating together. How do you establish that? That's a whole different conversation we can have. But typically they should be longer running than once a year, because otherwise you're not really setting a vision statement, you're setting a goal for the year. I can send one, but you can find one online too. They're great ones. I don't think I have one that's specific to your industry on my computer at the moment, but I'm sure I could pull one up. But if you Google it or look into industry standards, there are a lot out there, and you're going to need to tailor it. You are unique. I always say when you're building it, it should tie back to what your goals are as an organization. So if your goal is, say you are a hospital providing quality care, you have a statement to provide quality care, excellence, and to be the leading employer. That's your vision, right? That's what you want to do. All of those goals as a board should tie back to that. What are your practices that enable it? There's going to be some basics: interpersonal decorum and respect, decision-making processes, financial responsibility. Those are the bucket ones, but there should be some tailored to your organization. Yes?
I think you said something very important about vision. And
It just provides parameters. It doesn't mean it gives you every answer. You may say we're going to be a leading age, our leading senior independent living community for active seniors. Say you put that. Well, what does that mean? Like mentally active, physically active? I mean, I'm not saying that you're going to have a vision statement and it's going to, that's it. All of our decisions are made, but it provides some parameters for decision making and discussion where it says, well, at least we know this is out of bounds and this is inbound station. So it's not easy and it's not going to cure all, but it helps. Does that make sense? But you're right, it should not be fuzzy. I would argue if you take the time to do this, you'll probably go to less meetings. That's the reality.
That's everyone's job.
There's a book out right now, it's a best-selling book. It's called 9.5 Things You Would Do Differently If Disney Ran Your Hospital. I was just reading it the other day. It touches every industry, yes, absolutely. Yeah. But the vision is we're going to be a safe place, that is a safe and clean place that rivals any other experience that any person who we consider a customer compares us to. So if you compare it to your dry cleaner, they want to be better. If you compare it to Six Flags Great America, they want to be better. It's just being better than everyone else, which doesn't sound very nice when you say it out loud. Okay, one more and then I want to move forward. Yes?
Can long-range planning or future planning cut down on conflict?
Can long-range planning? Absolutely. Long-range planning and not just vision statement, but long-range planning, this is what we're doing that ties back to it. If we are going to be a safe community, for independent active seniors, I'm just using that because those were words I heard when we met. Absolutely. Because then you're going to go, well, what do we need to do to be a long-term, independent living, safe place? Well, we got to put money into our reserves because we have to do preventative maintenance. You see how this trickles down? So all of these things, yes, long-range planning cuts down on conflict because this is where we're going, and this is what our priorities are. Because the reality is everything will always be a priority, especially with the advent of technology. Heard something the other day and they said, it used to be in your lifetime technology would double twice. Like if we have this much technology, it would be this much, right? It's happening every 18 months now.